Well, welcome. Thank you all for coming this evening. And I'm Peter Kern, the director of the Global Public Health Program, and also the instructor for the class, for those of you who are taking this class for credit. I'd like to say a few words first about the lecture series. This is a lecture series that is co-sponsored this year by the Global Public Health Program, and especially the External Advisory Committee of that program, and the Institute for Health and Humanities. And we're very grateful for the support and co-sponsorship of the Institute as well. So tonight you have a very interesting lecture in store. Sarah Webb, who is the Program Director for Asia and Latin America with Days for Girls International, is going to be talking about menstrual hygiene, the intersection between women's health, economic empowerment, and environmental impact. Sarah graduated from the University of Puget Sound with her BA in political theory. I'm glad to see that she has some political science background, and environmental policy and decision making. She first fell in love with the world of international development and public health during a field school extension of an undergraduate course in Botswana during the summer of 2011, where she was studying the overlap between community-based natural resource management and women's empowerment. She has worked in international education as well as micro-enterprise development in both India and Ecuador, where much of the programming that she was implemented related to public health strategies like clean water, vision, public health awareness, and also environmental impact. During the year that she spent in India, Sarah's eyes were opened to the challenges and obstacles faced by women and girls during menstruation. And she has been a passionate advocate for menstrual hygiene initiatives ever since. Since joining Days for Girls in 2015, Sarah has been starting and supporting programming at the global level. She has had the opportunity to participate in health training, project management, and curriculum design in Uganda, Guatemala, Nepal, and India. Now Sarah directs the Days for Girls programming in Asia and Latin America, working closely with the core team on strategic planning, global growth strategy, and program support throughout her two regions of focus. Growing up in Montana, Sarah has long been a passionate advocate for environmental conservation and the outdoor world, and is excited to be pursuing a career that focuses on the intersections between public health, women's empowerment, and environmental conservation. What a great background. Please join me in welcoming Sarah for the lecture series.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and just use the mic for the camera, but if at any point you can't hear me and want the mic for the room, just let me know or wave and I can go ahead and connect that as well. Thank you so much for the introduction, Peter. I'm just going to get this turned on. Can everybody see that okay, or should we drop the lights a little bit?
Why don't we drop the lights?
Okay. Is that better? Awesome. Thank you so much. Great. So yes, as Peter said, I've been working at Days for Girls International, which is a nonprofit organization that focuses primarily on menstrual health and also other aspects of women's reproductive health, hygiene, and economic empowerment. And today during this presentation, I'll mostly be focusing on kind of the role that menstrual health and hygiene plays in the public health community and different innovative strategies that organizations like Days for Girls are using around the world in order to address this issue. And then at the end, I'll be focusing on two of our global leaders that have helped to advance this issue in Kenya and also in Nepal. So if you have any questions at any point, feel free to raise your hand, and otherwise there will be some time for questions at the end as well. So the first question that I get when I talk to people about working in this field is, why does menstruation matter? So why is this an issue that we're talking about, especially in the field of public health and international development? And why is that something that people, meaning both men and women, should invest time and resources in addressing? And there's a lot of different reasons for that, and this presentation will focus on a couple of those. But if you walk away with one kind of takeaway message today, that would be that menstruation matters because of the way that it affects every woman and girl's life for a significant majority of her lifetime. So whether that's on impacts that deal with education or the environment or economics, this is something that affects the majority of women and girls on average about every month for most of the time that they are alive. So it's a pretty big issue that has a really wide effect, whereas a lot of the other issues that we look at in public health are slightly more limited in the population that they affect. So that said, the conversation about menstrual hygiene, especially in an international spotlight, is something that's relatively new. And so if you look back at public health initiatives and international development initiatives that have been implemented globally, a big piece of the conversation that's consistently missing is how people around the world are managing menstruation, meaning what women are doing and what girls are doing in order to address menstruation on a month-to-month basis. And it's because of that question and kind of that gap in that conversation that organizations like Days for Girls have started to commit their full attention and focus on issues surrounding menstrual health and hygiene. So menstruation as a public health issue. What I was saying before, it's largely been left out of the conversation, and part of that is because of the discomfort of talking about menstruation. So unlike issues like uterine prolapse or prenatal care or maternal health, menstruation carries a certain type of stigma and taboo that a lot of other health issues just don't have surrounding it. And a big part of that is because of traditions and beliefs that different communities globally, whether that's here in the US or in other parts of the world, have surrounding menstruation. Looking at menstruation on a global scale, a lot of international development issues that look at women's health completely fail to address menstruation, or if they do, it's generally a quick side note in a larger conversation about reproductive health. And while that's important to focus on the issue as a whole, a lot of times menstruation is glossed over and women and girls are left without an awareness of what's happening with their bodies and how to healthily, that's not a great word, but how to safely manage menstruation during that time frame. And then finally, if we're taking a step back and looking at the life course theory, or the idea that basically the health of the mother and the health of her family can have effects on the health of a child and the health of their kind of development into adulthood, menstruation is a huge piece of that conversation because of the way that it affects maternal health and the health of women and girls globally. So looking at this as a global problem, just to kind of get an idea of what's happening with menstruation around the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, 1 in 10 girls do not have a solution to manage their monthly cycle. So that means that they don't have access to things like pads or tampons, or if they do, those things are too unaffordable or the cost is too high for them to safely rely on those alternatives. In India, 113 million adolescent girls don't have access to a solution to manage menstruation. And in rural parts of Brazil, about 30% of girls will miss school because of menstruation. So these are all issues that affect people, whether they are in Asia or South America or Africa or the United States, because it's an issue that carries so much weight in each of these communities. So to give you an idea of kind of the demographic and the group that we're talking about, globally there are about 1.5 billion women and girls who are of reproductive age. And of those 1.5 billion, 300 million of them are living on less than $1.25 a day. And that is the main demographic that Days for Girls and similar organizations are focusing on to reach with menstrual hygiene awareness. And the reason for that is because that is generally the demographic that doesn't have the resources or the ability to invest in things like pads and tampons, or those things just aren't even available in the communities that they're living and working in. So when we're talking about kind of the main demographic that we focus on, it's generally that group of people, the 300 million women and girls living on less than $1 a day. But we do also do programming here in the US and in parts of Europe and in Canada. That's generally just kind of a second sort of part of our programming. So So looking at the impacts of menstrual health, these are kind of the 5 main impacts that we talk about when we look at why menstrual hygiene and why reproductive health with a focus on menstruation is so important. So the first one is reproductive tract infections. And while those are common in many parts of the world for a lot of different reasons, one of the main causes is poor menstrual hygiene. And so in a lot of the areas that we're working in, if women and girls don't have access to pads or tampons, a lot of them are using things like newspaper or old rags. A lot of times they use leaves or just different materials that they can use so that they can continue to go to school and go to work and avoid having menstruation be something that affects their day-to-day life. That said, because of poor hygiene practices during menstruation, a lot of women and girls start to develop reproductive tract infections. And that ultimately can result in either expensive visits to hospitals, challenge in accessing hospitals, and occasionally death if those symptoms are not treated. The second issue is with school and work. So when women and girls in areas throughout Africa and Asia and Latin America don't have an option for menstrual hygiene, a lot of them resort to staying home. So there's a lot of girls that we work with that prior to having a solution for menstruation would skip school if they were menstruating, or they would stay home from work if they were menstruating. And not only does that create a gap between their ability to go to school and pursue an education, but for families that rely on 2 incomes, it also creates a significant economic burden when women are not able to work during the days that they're menstruating. In countries like India, menstruation is one of the leading causes that girls stop going to school. And so a lot of girls, when they start missing school for 1 week every month, they slowly fall so far behind, that they decide to just stop going altogether because it doesn't seem like something they can keep up with. And so menstrual hygiene is at the forefront of conversations now about how to keep girls in school and how to make sure that we close that gap that we see between girls and boys' education in a lot of countries around the world. The third issue is the environmental impact. So looking at current solutions for menstrual hygiene, whether it's here in the US or at a global scale, most of the solutions are disposable, meaning that you would use them once and then throw them away. And the challenge that that creates for any country, so again, whether that's here in the US or somewhere else, is the amount of environmental waste that we're producing because of menstruation. And so in the US, there are systems in place for the most part where we deal with environmental waste, and there's ways that we can dispose of those products. But in a lot of communities, again, looking specifically at India, that poses a really large health risk because of the lack of environmental cleanup options. So in India, especially in more rural parts of the country, people often just throw things like menstrual hygiene products on the side of the street, and slowly those pile up. And not only does that create problems for the environment, but it's also a public health risk by having blood and kind of open collection of menstrual hygiene products. The other thing is that in things like pads and tampons, a lot of those use plastics and other types of chemicals, whether that's bleach or just different like kind of scented chemicals that they put in pads and tampons. And so that can also create a really large environmental risk because they don't break down easily, and then they end up staying in landfills or other trash collection areas for an extended amount of time. The fourth issue is looking at cultural tradition and practices surrounding menstruation. So in a lot of the world, women and girls go through processes of coming of age ceremonies or rituals. And in much of the world, those are tied to menstruation. So in India, again, using India as an example, since that's one of the main areas I work in India, there's generally a celebration when a girl gets her first period, and that's both to celebrate the idea of fertility and coming of age, but also to signify to people in the community that she is ready for marriage. And so a lot of these traditions have really strong cultural ties and also religious beliefs that are based on the concept of menstruation. And then finally is the impact of shame and isolation. So kind of alongside those cultural beliefs and different religious beliefs and traditions is this concept of shame. So in a lot of the areas that we work in, and again, including the United States in that, women and girls don't feel comfortable openly talking about their periods. So even if you think back to like middle school or elementary school, when we first started talking about those in classrooms, people laugh. And it's uncomfortable, and it's something that people don't want to talk about. And that type of shame and that type of embarrassment on these topics is only exaggerated in contexts where people don't openly talk about women's health. And so in a lot of the parts of Nepal and India and throughout Africa that we work in, when we do our programming and we go in and talk about menstruation, this is one of the first times that people have heard about this issue in a public setting. And so a big part of the impact on health is shifting this narrative of shame and isolation towards one where people feel comfortable talking about menstruation just like they would with any other health issue. So based on that, when we work with women and girls around the globe, we take a lot of notes and write down a lot of ideas of what people associate menstruation with. And these are some of the most common words that we come across. So menstruation, again, at a global scale, is looked at as something that's dirty or miserable, or is associated with feelings of discomfort or feeling ashamed. And these are things that we can change. So this is something that there is a solution to, and that as a public health community, we can work together to overcome. So Days for Girls is the name of the organization that I work for, and it's also the name of a movement that we have started to try to get more and more women and men to form a network that really addresses this issue. So for the kind of second part of this presentation, I'll mostly be focusing on what Days for Girls does and how we do that, and then we'll just look at a couple of the different examples of where that's worked. So Days for Girls was founded about 10 years ago, towards the end of 2008, by our founder and current CEO, Celeste Mergens. And Celeste founded the organization after she had been doing some work in Kenya with another organization that worked really closely with an orphanage. And Celeste was there volunteering and working with a lot of the kids. And this was right around the time where Kenya was going through the civil war that they had back in 2008. And one day, her and her husband were working with this group, and they came to visit, and they were communicating with the school director, and the numbers of orphans coming into the orphanage were really drastically increasing because of the civil war that was happening in Kenya. And Celeste was working on doing a series of fundraisers to help with getting clean water and food and access to resources for the kids in the orphanage. And she came back to the US after that and continued this fundraising, and one night was talking to the teacher at the school and realized that they had never had a conversation about what they were doing for menstruation. So this school was entirely relying on Celeste, her husband, and his organization to fundraise enough money to bring in food and water, which meant that they probably also needed support for menstruation and menstrual hygiene supplies. So Celeste wrote an email to them asking what they had been doing for that. And when the headmaster and the other teachers replied, they told her that in Kenya and in the orphanage, because there's no funding for something like that, the girls generally just sit in a room on a piece of cardboard when they get their period. So they're not able to leave, they don't have anything they can use to go to school, they're not able to interact with their friends, and they just kind of wait out that process. And that was something that really upset Celeste for very obvious reasons. That's something that women and girls should not have to go through when they're menstruating. And so she decided that she wanted to do something about that. And so the first thing that she did was fundraise a lot of money to sponsor disposable pads to go over to the school. So she sent a shipment of the pads. The girls got them, they were really excited, and then a month later, most of them were gone because everyone had had their period and they had exhausted that supply. So she started fundraising again, and pretty quickly decided that that probably wasn't the best alternative. So in addition to realizing that it would require this ongoing process of fundraising and sending disposable pads, the girls didn't know what to do with them. So she said that on her follow-up visit, she saw a lot of pads kind of scattered around the outskirts of the school. The latrines were starting to get backed up because people didn't know they weren't supposed to dispose of them there. And so she decided that disposable pads probably weren't the way to go. And so from there, Celeste decided to start looking at washable pads. And washable pads, there's a lot of different varieties of them now, but back in 2008, this was one of the earlier options that existed. And so Celeste founded the Days for Girls kit, which basically includes the contents that you see here. So it's made entirely of reusable materials. So they're made of liners, which are the part that absorb the menstrual flow, as well as shields, which is the waterproof layer that kind of snaps into place. And then we also include things like underwear, washcloths, soap, and instructions for how to properly care for them. That said, this is not the initial version that we started working with. So when Celeste started sewing washable pads, the first one was shaped exactly like a pad and was white, because pads are generally white. And then after she tested it out, she realized, again, for obvious reasons, that they probably shouldn't be white. Most women don't want to reuse white washable pads. And so slowly she turned the pad design into this. So this is one of the liners. So this is what they look like. Obviously, it doesn't look exactly like the kind of disposable pads that we're all familiar with. And so this is made of 2 layers of flannel. So it, when you fold it together to use it in the kit or the Days for Girls pad, it has 6 layers together, and you can use 2 of them at a time. So that ends up being 12 layers. So there's flexibility based on the needs of each person that's using it. And then the second component of it is the shield. And so the shield is the part that actually holds the pad in place. And you're welcome to come see these after the presentation if you want. There's plenty of them up front. But the shield basically snaps into place kind of the same way a pad with wings would. So it holds it into place. And then it has a waterproof layer inside. And that's made from, it's called polyurethane laminate. It's just a plastic layer that prevents the leakage through the material if the girl does experience a leak or a heavier flow than normal. And so this is the kit that we've kind of settled on. So this is the 28th version of the pattern. And every time we make a change on the pattern, it's based on feedback from people around the globe. So when the initial patterns were first released, people would use them and then they'd come back and say, you know, this is too long or it's too short or it doesn't fit into my underwear correctly. And so all of these changes were based on listening to that feedback and finding a product that pretty consistently would work for women and girls globally. That said, we know that everybody's different, so there are 2 different sizes of them. So we have the kind of the standard size and then the longer size, so that there is a little bit more flexibility with how people want pads to be. So this is kind of the product solution that we operate from, and this pretty quickly became a really big hit in areas where people didn't have options for alternatives. And it also became a really big hit in areas where people were using disposable products but wanted to shift towards something more environmentally friendly. So one thing that's really great on a sustainability perspective is that the Days for Girls kit can last between 2 and 4 years. And so with that in mind, it saves not only a lot of fundraising and a lot of sending of disposable pads to places that need them, but it also means that people have a solution for a longer amount of time. So looking at that and starting to assess this program, Days for Girls started to distribute these in schools because we decided that that was probably the best demographic to focus on if we wanted to keep girls in school, start to close that education gap, and then really assess whether these were working. So the main location that we focused on at the beginning was Africa, and we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about how we've expanded. But based on early studies of what we were doing, the school absentee rates in Uganda dropped from 25% to 3% in schools that were studied and surveyed after receiving a Days for Girls kit, and in Kenya from 36% to 8%. And then of the girls that we worked with in Kenya, 87% of them said that they were now more comfortable going to school after receiving a Days for Girls kit. So this was really promising and really exciting information to get early on because it meant that at the very least what we were doing was working and was creating impact and was something that we could hopefully start to scale so that we could address this issue in other locations. And so this is sort of how we've expanded. This graphic hasn't been exactly updated, but this is generally sort of the pockets that you see Days for Girls working in. So earlier this month, we actually hit our 1 millionth women and girls of people that have received the Days for Girls kit, and that's in over 100 countries since 2008. So we have seen really, really rapid expansion, which has been a really exciting thing to watch from such a small organization. And as you can see on this map, the huge focus is still definitely on Africa in terms of the volume of kits that we've distributed, but we've seen a lot of growth in other parts of the world as well with growing kind of long-term programs in those locations. So the main things that the kit was designed to overcome and really does a good job of is lack of infrastructure, lack of running water, and distribution issues. So when you think about disposable pads and why people aren't using them globally, obviously one of those things is cost. And the Days for Girls kit works to address that. But the other big 3 are lack of infrastructure, running water, and distribution challenges. So in most of the areas that we're working in, Always Pads, for example, or Kotex isn't necessarily shipping large containers of pads internationally. So in a lot of countries, there are local alternatives, but they don't necessarily work very well. They're generally pretty expensive. And due to lack of infrastructure, they tend to only be available in more urban populations. The second issue is running water. A lot of washable pads have the challenge of running water because obviously to clean a washable pad you need water. And the Days for Girls kit was intentionally designed in a way that uses very minimal water and can be cleaned with gray water. So most of the kits, when you're washing them, as long as you're washing them consistently, only require about 1/4 inch to 1 inch of water to wash them. And they also dry really quickly. And so if you're living in a really humid area that has monsoon, that's also a really important consideration, is that you're not using something that's so thick that it's not drying overnight. And then finally, distribution. So the other big challenge that a lot of groups have seen is that when they launch these washable pad programs, they're really restricted to one specific area in order to distribute them. And the Days for Girls kit it's really widely accepted, but we've also had a lot of success in getting people on board to help with the distribution side of things, which is what has allowed us to scale so quickly. And then just looking at kind of other ideas of what sets the Days for Girls kit apart. So one main thing is high user acceptance. So as I was saying at the beginning of the presentation, a lot of women and girls who don't have access to things like pads and tampons are generally using cloth or rags or other forms of fabric already. And so by presenting the Days for Girls kit, it's a pretty easy sell in the sense that they're already using something relatively similar, and this is generally a little bit more comfortable than that alternative. As I mentioned, they're also very easy to wash and they dry really quickly. They can last for up to 2 to 4 years. And then looking at price, the Days for Girls pod, which is kind of the most basic version of the kit that we have, is about $1.50. And then most people on average would spend up to $144 on disposable pads in that same time frame. Can actually skip that one for now. But, so looking at how this has worked, one of the biggest things that has allowed us to grow so quickly is the way that our model is structured. So at Days for Girls, we have 2 branches of the organization that really work in junction with one another to reach women and girls at a global scale. So the first thing that we did was allowed people to form chapters. And the chapters are basically volunteer groups of the organization that make and donate the washable pads. So from when we were founded in 2008 up until now, we have formed over 1,000 volunteer chapter groups globally. So those groups are mostly located in the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, with some groups scattered throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The second thing is that we have locally led social enterprises, and that's a program that we'll talk more about in a minute, but those are in about 15 different countries where we're focused more on the long-term impact of building out these solutions. And then finally, like most nonprofits, we also operate off of in-kind donations and a lot of financial support from our donors. So this is a glimpse at how that model is structured. So we have kind of on the left side, the chapters and teams, and then over here on the right side, the enterprise model. So in my role in overseeing our programs in Asia and Latin and South America, I'm predominantly working with the enterprise model. But the organization is really structured so that these 2 models complement one another. So the chapters and teams have been around from the beginning, so they've really been part of Days for Girls since we were founded in 2008. And these groups are making the Days for Girls kits and donating them, raising awareness about menstruation and why this is such a big issue, and then also kind of working with Days for Girls to try to reach areas that are high need locations. So for the volunteer model, we're focused more on locations like emergency and relief settings. So when we do work with the Syrian refugee population, for example, that's mostly through the volunteer model. This is also the group that we will often use to seed a new market. So if we're looking at expanding to another location, the volunteer model will generally help donate the materials that we need so that we can get that started. And then on the other side, we have the enterprise model, and that is based more off of building sustainable businesses. And so in that model, we are working directly with local women, and sometimes men, but it's usually women that are more passionate about menstruation. And so we're working with local women and men to help form these businesses where they are making and selling the washable pads instead of donating them. And the idea with that is that by selling them, they eventually build this sustainable model that doesn't require outside donations. And so the area or region that they're working in basically self-sustains in terms of producing the kits that are needed for that area, and then shifting the conversation about menstruation to being one where women and girls are able to invest in this as a solution, but are also open to talking about it. And so using that hybrid approach, so having both the social enterprises and the volunteers, we've been able to reach 1 million women and girls globally in over 100 countries, with 15 countries having long-term social enterprises and another dozen that are well on their way to having those programs, and then over 1,100 chapters and teams. So in addition to the product and the Days for Girls kit that we're using to distribute globally, we also have a really heavy emphasis on education. So for us, it's, the kit is a really great way for women and girls to manage menstruation, and it gives a really strong alternative to what is available in a lot of contexts. But equally important, if not more important, is the issue of education. So like I was saying at the beginning of the presentation, a lot of times when we're going into a community or working in an area, this is kind of the first time that people have talked about women's health, especially menstruation, in a public setting. So it's generally considered something that should be a little bit quieter. It's not necessarily taught in the school systems. And so we want to make sure that in addition to having the Days for Girls kit and a way to manage menstruation, they know why menstruation happens. And a piece of that is that it's just important to know how our bodies work in order to care for them properly. But it's also really important that women and girls understand that menstruation isn't something to be ashamed of. And so we have a comprehensive health curriculum that gets taught alongside the distribution of the kits so that women and girls, and also boys, we teach this to boys as well, are aware of these issues. So this curriculum is generally a 2 to 3 hour training, but can also be a multi-day training depending on our partner and what their goals are. But these are the subjects that we always include. So we always go through general hygiene, so that includes things like hand washing, how do we take care of our bodies and make sure that we're maintaining personal hygiene. We walk through the concept of puberty and what that means and why that's important in understanding menstruation. We teach both male and female anatomy. We walk through the menstrual cycle, so teaching girls not only what the menstrual cycle is and what that means for their bodies, but how they can start to track that and know when they're going to have their next period. We talk about reproduction as well as self-defense, and then we teach a really in-depth section on how to care for the Days for Girls kits. One of the biggest questions that we get in the washable pad world is whether these are actually sanitary, and that is something that a lot of people think that washable pads are not, and that's not true. So as long as they are cared for properly and used properly, they're a totally sanitary, safe alternative to disposable pads. But that same logic applies to disposable pads. So disposable pads are not particularly sanitary if you use them incorrectly either. So it's the same issue. You just want to make sure people know what they're using and how often to swap them out, how often to wash them, so that they don't have things like reproductive tract infections. So in addition to teaching the health curriculum, a big emphasis that we have is on mobilizing local leadership. So my role is much more about identifying and supporting local leaders to implement the programs that we just talked through than it is on me actually implementing those programs. So in Nepal, all of our staff are Nepali. In Guatemala, all of our staff are Guatemalan. And we really focus on building that local sustainable leadership because we want these programs to be able to run with or without our support. That said, we will always support these programs that we've started, but we want to make sure that they have everything in place to be leaders and to really change this issue at the community level. So in our enterprise model, there are 2 different programs that we have. So we have the Days for Girls offices and Days for Girls enterprises. The offices can be thought of more as us kind of growing up and scaling up the programs. So those are direct extensions of the organization that really hold a management piece in the areas that they're working in, whereas the enterprises are partnership opportunities that are more franchised out. So we kind of approach this from a 2-pronged approach of scaling up management hubs and support systems while also franchising out the model. So with the enterprises, groups can basically apply to partner with Days for Girls, and then they go through a certification process where they learn how to make the washable pads, how to start their own businesses, and how to teach the health education. We don't operate it off of a totally free market theory, so we definitely help control the price points so that the groups are all supporting one another rather than outcompeting one another. And then we also provide kind of oversight and requirements in terms of the education and the curriculum that's being taught alongside these programs. The second thing that scaling up the local leadership really does is allows for more program adaptability and cultural context. So with any health issue, the needs of communities and the challenges that they're facing are really different based on location. So in Nepal, for example, we work a lot with a cultural tradition called Chaupadi, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. Whereas in parts of Uganda and Kenya, there are more concerns about female genital cutting or other rites of passage processes. So based on the location, these local leaders are really able to provide more localized knowledge about what the needs are, and then also ways that those needs can be addressed in a way that's culturally sensitive and appropriate. And then finally, that also allows us to be a little bit more flexible and adaptable with the women's health curriculum. So in countries like Nepal and India, where we know that there's a higher rate of things like uterine prolapse or complications after pregnancy, that's a component that we can pull more into the curriculum, whereas in other areas, we do talk about that, and it's still important, but not necessarily with as much emphasis as in countries that need that information. So looking at menstrual health and kind of speaking to the title of tonight's presentation, it really is an issue that cuts across a lot of different sectors. So it deals with issues of education, both in terms of providing health education and making sure people have accurate information, but also ensuring that girls and women can continue to pursue education and not be held back because of menstruation. For obvious reasons, it affects women's health. So whether we're looking at reproductive tract infections or knowing how to track the menstrual cycle, or knowing what's normal within the menstrual cycle versus what would maybe require the attention of a doctor, women are able to make decisions based on their own health needs. The third is economic empowerment. So through the business model that we have, we create a lot of economic opportunities for women in their communities. And these are in communities where women oftentimes aren't the main people working. And so by having this flexible business model where they really do dictate their own schedules can be a really amazing opportunity for women who aren't necessarily able to enter kind of a more traditional workforce. It also addresses issues of environmental conservation, so working with communities to cut down on waste and the environmental impact of menstruation. And finally, in a lot of ways, most importantly, is dignity, so making sure that people don't feel ashamed or stigmatized by menstruating. So with that in mind, a lot of our talks and presentations really center on how this is a cross-cutting issue by looking at the Millennium Development Goals. So these are the goals set out by the UN to reduce poverty and really increase equality and access to people globally. And the ones with check marks are the ones that Days for Girls directly works with. There's a couple others on here that we arguably affect, but these are kind of the main ones that we directly touch through the menstrual hygiene programming and the business model. So the next is impact evaluation. So with any public health program, we also want to measure if what we're doing is effective, and that's something that can be a huge challenge, which is true in a lot of different sectors and fields. In the issue of menstruation, one of the biggest challenges that we're faced with is that there really isn't that much data on this to date. And so that's partially because menstruation wasn't really talked about openly and globally as a program until pretty recently, but it's also because it's really hard to collect accurate data. And the reason for that is with any survey, there's obviously some level of personal bias. But especially in regards to menstruation, people are not openly answering these questions. So if you're in front of a room and asking, how many people have started menstruating, like very few girls are eager to put their hands up in a classroom of people. And then another challenge is when we start talking about, what are you using for menstruation, fewer and fewer people want to answer that question. So like a lot of organizations, we have struggled from the lack of global data that exists on the current status of menstrual health and current solutions. So we have really amazing anecdotal data that speaks to the fact that this is a need and that people really want it and that it's an important issue. Those numbers are a little bit less quantitative than we would like them to be. The other issue is that there's also just a lack of a concerted effort to measure this impact at a global scale. So a lot of times when we're looking at opportunities to partner with universities or public health programs, menstruation gets one question in a survey, but it doesn't get more than that. So it's usually, do you have access to menstrual hygiene solutions? And for a lot of people, that question doesn't even make sense because they don't know what menstrual hygiene refers to or what it means. So one challenge that we've been working on really specifically in the last 2 years is looking at how we analyze our impact and how we know that things are actually changing. And so Days for Girls has created its own series of surveys. I won't walk you through all the details because I think they're really fun, but not everybody would agree with that. But basically, we have a series of surveys that are available through an app called Kobo, and that's something that's available as an actual downloadable app on Android phones. But if you have an iPhone, you just have to bookmark it, and you can still access it offline, which is awesome in a lot of the contexts that we work in. But basically, we go through a series of pre-distribution data to know what things were like before we got there. And so that's asking questions like, what do you currently do for menstruation, and how do you currently feel during menstruation? And we do those surveys anonymously. So in most of the classrooms that we do these in, it's kind of like the game Heads Up, 7-Up that a lot of us might have played in elementary school, where everyone's head is down and then you raise your hand for different answers. So we have a series of codes. So if they want to say yes, they put their hand up like this. If they're trying to say no, they make a fist. And that way, everyone is putting their hands up. Everybody's participating. People aren't, trying to look at their neighbors. And if they are, they can't really tell what their answer is. It can be a challenge to explain this when you're working through translators. And it can be a challenge to get kids to sit still during this. But it's definitely the more accurate data that has been collected, because we know that it's not biased by responses. In addition to doing that, we also do individual surveys. And so we have one-on-one conversations where a local health trainer or a local partner of ours goes through the survey data with a woman or a girl and helps them fill it in. And generally in that one-on-one setting, people are much more open to talking. So then after that, we provide the Days for Girls kits. We do the health training. We do whatever other partnership activities we're going to engage in. And then we wait for 3 months or 6 months, depending on the funding that we have for M&E, but also depending on our ability to get back to certain project sites. And then after that, we collect post-distribution data. So we go through and ask those same questions again, and then can kind of more specifically measure that impact. So whether there was, for that particular school, a change in absentee rates, and whether for that particular school or women's group, people noticed a difference in the way that they felt during their menstruation. So that's kind of the way that we're collecting data. We do still collect a lot of anecdotal data because people tend to just tell a lot of stories. And so that can really supplement what the numbers are saying. But this is kind of the first big concerted effort to collect this data. And we've had a lot of really interesting results come in from that. Great. So now I want to transition a little bit more to some of the local leaders that we have at Days for Girls. Our team here in the US and in some of our other kind of remote locations around the country are amazing and really talented women who have really advanced this issue. But the women who are really creating an ongoing and sustainable change are the women that we're working with in the countries that we work in. So the first person that I want to look at is Christine Kamazi. So Christine is one of our enterprise leaders in Nairobi, Kenya. So she has been with us for the last 3 years working on this project, and she started just on her own. So she decided that this was an issue she cared about. She wanted to partner with us in the enterprise model. She successfully sourced and partnered with people that were willing to sponsor her to get started, and since then has had really amazing impact. So in the last couple of years, she's sold over 1,600 Days for Girls kits, and that doesn't include the ones that she's donated. So that's just looking at the business side of her operation. And she now employs 9 local women and men. It's 7 women and 2 men, but it's awesome that the men are involved. And to tell Christine's story, I'm actually going to switch over to a video from Christine so that she can tell that story instead of me.
Passion as a girl was to become a doctor. But since my periods were getting in my way, spending my days because I was menstruating was really a lonely journey. My mama left me when I was very young, so when I started my menstruation, she was not there like to tell me or to guide me on what to do.
Some girls, they don't attend school because of the periods.
That means that you're going to miss school like 5 days every month. Every time your menstruation comes, you are going to be just inside the house like you are sick because you can't go outside.
In Kenya, it is very normal. You're told to have a boyfriend and then he can give you money to buy the pads. So you just have to maybe sleep with the boy and then he will give you money to buy the pads, and that is very risky for a girl because if you get pregnant, there is no going on in school. Great. My dream, my passion is to become a doctor.
Days for Girls Kitty, it is so beautiful. I love it because of the colors that they use. They make you feel good. They use the flannel material. And the flannel material, it is very soft, it is very friendly, it is easy to wash, and it lasts 3 to 4 years. It makes you feel like a very beautiful person.
I am free, I'm comfortable. I can just jump the way I want. I can play sports, I can play basketball, I can play football, anything that I want to do. I am just confident about myself while in that Days for Girls Kit.
They want girls to stay in school.
Maybe they will be the doctors of tomorrow, the president of tomorrow. You can't know now.
So my passion is just to keep the girls in school and reach every girl outside there so that they can stay in school.
That is Christine's story. And so before I move on, she's one of our kind of first people that started in the enterprise model. Since then, it has changed a lot, and we've added things. We've adjusted some of the programming. Sorry. Close that. And she has consistently come back for follow-up workshops. She's really engaged in mentoring other enterprises that start in Kenya. Our closest office to Christine is our Uganda office, and so Kenya doesn't have one of those management hubs, but she works really closely with the Uganda team to make sure that she's supporting in the kit orders that they get and really spreading this program to Nairobi. So Christine is definitely one of our kind of favorite stories because she's just had such a strong impact on the girls and women that she's working with. So then the next person that I want to talk about is Leela. So Leela Singh Khada is the project manager of the Days for Girls Kalikut project in Western Nepal. So this is actually a really recent project. It was launched just in April of 2017, so we're coming up on just a year. And this is a project that differs from some of our other programs in the sense that in addition to the Days for Girls kits and the health education, we're really focusing on one specific cultural tradition, and that's the tradition of Chaupadi. I don't know if anyone has heard of Chaupadi. It has recently been in the international spotlight because a couple of women and girls in the last couple of years have died because of this cultural practice. And Peter actually just gave me an article on this in the New York Times, so if you have a chance to look it up after the presentation, it's a really strong cultural practice that's prevalent in a lot of Western Nepal. And Chaupadi is a practice that a lot of women feel very strongly about, whether they are on one side of the conversation or another. This is a practice that has really strong ties to Hinduism, and it also has really strong ties to the community structure and the way that communities kind of coexist with one another in Western Nepal. So the practice of Chaupadi is basically a process where during menstruation, women and girls are banished to menstrual huts during their periods. So that is sometimes cattle sheds, it can be goat sheds, it can just be huts that are kind of away from the community. And generally the expectation is that women and girls are in that hut the entire time that they're menstruating, and that if they leave to go to the bathroom or to do something during the day, that other people shouldn't see them do that. And so this process, there are kind of different iterations of it that are common throughout India and throughout other parts of Nepal. But for the most part, it is isolated to Western Nepal in this particular form. So I'm just going to show a couple minutes of a video on Chaupadi, and then we'll come back to Leela's story. So just while this loads, because it has kind of a long intro part, this is a documentary produced by a different nonprofit in Nepal, but just has the storyline of what Chaupadi entails.
In our Hindu scriptures, it is very clearly mentioned that the menstrual blood is a product of the sin, come from the God. That is why they also consider it impure and dirty.
पहिलोपल्ट हुँदा एक्कासी कहिले नगएको एकदम मनमा आतुर लाग्यो खुल्दुली लाग्यो के भयो कस्तो भयो भन्ने जस्तो भयो अनि कसैलाई थाहै म त एक दिन त कसैलाई थाहै पनि दिएन थाहै नदिएरै अनि भित्रै बसिराखेँ अनि पछिल्लो दिनमा अब कहीँ देउता लाग्छ कि केही लाग्छ कि मनमा दुख्छु हुँदै हुँदै पछिल्लो दिनमा गएर वनमा जङ्गलमा लुकेँ
If anything happen in their community or family, they blame the girls and women who menstruate.
छाउपल दिँदैन दुधै दिँदैन घरभित्र बस्न दिँदैन सबैले श्रीमान्छन् हिजो बेलुकै हाम्रो मम्मी बाउले नुन्थ्यो कि नै देउता आएर तँलाई श्रीमुसु भयो साथ दिन त्यही भएर भन्नुभयो हिजो मलाई बाँडो हालेर राख्नुभयो
During menstruation, girls and women segregated from the family member. Sometimes they keep in a separate hut. Sometimes they put in a separate house. Sometimes they put in a separate corner of the room.
हाम्रो त बस्ने ठाउँ सफा त सफा छ चिसो हुन्छ माथि सुत्ने कोठा जस्तो तातो हुने कुरो भएन तल कोठामा सुत्नुपर्छ अब खाट छ चिसो हुन्छ अब एसी र गरौँ डसनाहरू दिन्नन् अब कम्बलहरू दिन्छन् रातभरि नसुतेर बच्चा कहीँ सर्प आउँछ कि केही आउँछ कि यस्तो चिसोमा कहीँ निमोनिया आउँछ कि
They cannot.
Right, and I will share the link with you so that if you want to see the rest of that, you have a chance to. Okay. And so while this reopens, this project is a project that was launched in 2017 where Days for Girls is partnering with local women to really address this conversation and the issue of Chowpatty within their communities. Just one second. So Leela Singh Kata is the project manager of the Chowpatty project or the Calicut project, and she grew up in this community. So she grew up in Calicut, which is one of the districts in Nepal. And since April of this year, she's been leading projects throughout different sub-districts of Calicut to focus on the issue of Chowpatty. And this is a project that Days for Girls has been really intentional about in a lot of different ways. So for us, it's really important that the conversation is not that Chowpatty is bad or that Chowpatty should stop or that women and girls shouldn't participate in it. For us, it's important that the conversation is about choice. And so we want to equip women and girls and community members with enough information about reproductive health and menstruation and what it means and what's happening with someone's body when they're menstruating so that they can make the choice that is most comfortable to them. So for us, the standpoint is not that Chowpatty is a bad practice, it's that there are ways that it could be shifted in order to maintain the health and the dignity of women and girls. So in the last couple of years, Nepal has really come into the international spotlight on this issue because of a couple of deaths that have made international headlines. And for the most part, those are deaths that have happened because of either poisonous snake bites or suffocation in the huts. And so in most of these communities, they're really high in elevation in the Himalaya, and during the winter, women and girls, kind of like the lady was saying in the film, they don't have blankets or things to keep warm. So a lot of them will start small fires inside the hut to try to stay warm. And because of the smoke, a lot of them have suffocated because of the lack of oxygen inside. So the government in July actually made Chowpatty a criminal crime in Nepal. So before, it was considered illegal, but it wasn't enforced. And so it, just like in Nepal, smoking is also illegal in public, but you walk by like 40 people every couple minutes who are smoking outside. So it's one of those laws where they have a lot of laws that, you know, such and such is illegal, but there's not actually an enforcement mechanism. So this year they changed it so that Chowpatty and the participation in Chowpatty did have an enforcement mechanism. And that mechanism was a fine or potential jail time to anybody who forced a woman or girl to participate in Chowpatty. That said, that law in and of itself is not going to be enough to change this practice. So since the law was passed in July, there have already been 2 women and girls who have died in Chhaupadi. And a big part of that is because it wasn't supplemented with education. And so coming in and saying that this law exists doesn't change the reality that for hundreds and hundreds of years people have practiced Chhaupadi. And so the project that we're doing is focused on providing the Days for Girls kit, giving a solution to menstrual hygiene management, talking about education, but then also having really open community circles or women's circles on the practice of Chhaupadi. So looking at what aspects of this tradition are important to people. What parts of Chhaupadi really matter to people's personal or religious or community beliefs? What do women who are participating in this practice actually think about it? Do they want it to stop? Do they want to continue it? And so Leela has really spearheaded this project and has really started to lead a strong group of women who are talking about this issue in their communities and doing so in a way that the conversation isn't about shame or reprimanding people for participating in Chhaupadi, but looking at ways in which they can uphold the tradition and their culture while also making sure that women and girls are not in harm's way while they're doing it. So these are just a few photos from Calicut. I went out with the team in April when we launched the project, mostly just to observe and to make sure that they didn't need any additional support. But this is just to give you an idea of kind of the location and the remoteness of this area. For those of you not super familiar with Nepal, the largest city in Nepal is Kathmandu, and this location is kind of depends on whether the monsoon is happening or not and like what the weather conditions are, but it's anywhere between a 20 and 30-hour bus ride from Kathmandu. We generally fly part of the way so that the team isn't traveling for 3 days at a time, but it's about a 2-hour plane ride followed by a 15-hour Jeep ride, again, depending on road conditions and whether there's a strike on the roads. So the moral of that is that it's really far away. And so one of the big challenges in addressing this issue is making sure that we can get the equipment that's needed out to Calicut. So we have had a lot of very innovative practices of trying to get washable pads out to Calicut, which include a variety of shipped bags on airplanes, to tying them on top of buses, to sending them with family members that are going back and forth. But we are starting an enterprise out here that will support that long term. And then we also do a training program called Make Your Own, where we teach women and girls how to produce their own washable pads for personal use, not necessarily for sale, but to make sure that they have the skill set and access to the materials they need if they wanted to continue to produce them. So these are, Leela's the one to the far left, and then Sunita is another one of our trainers just in the middle, and then on the right is Celeste, our founder and CEO. And this was at the first Women's Circle that we had hosted, so this was really just talking to people and getting an idea of how they felt about this issue, what issues they thought women were facing in their communities, and ways that they thought organizations like Days for Girls could help with that. To us, it's really important that this is a project that's locally led and locally managed. We really want this to be something that people are taking local ownership of and doing so in a way that's culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive. So we have played much more of a supporting role in terms of connecting with the team, seeing what they need to make this project a success, but really putting the management and the implementation in the hands of our staff. This is just to give you an idea of what some of the Chhaupadi huts look like. So this is a Chhaupadi hut that is actually relatively close to the house. So this structure on the side is actually the rest of the main house. So this one's not in the middle of the forest, but it is still, for the most part, outdoors and pretty unsheltered, especially in the winter months. The girl that was living in this house actually has stopped going to this hut. So she and her family have kind of reached a compromise where they are comfortable with her staying in the house as long as she's in a separate room as the rest of the family. And that's really great progress. So that's something that this project has only been going on for a couple of months, and it's really empowering and exciting to see that the team has already had such a strong impact on leading these conversations and finding ways to work with people that still respect the culture and the tradition, but also put women's health and safety at the forefront of the conversation. And this is just a quick story from Namatra, which is one of the girls that has been working with us on the Calicut project. So I won't read the whole thing, but she says, "I received the Days for Girls sanitary kits, which were very easy to use and effective as well. I came to know that period is a natural process and it's beautiful. As a trainer, I'm able to speak boldly in front of people. I live in my house in a separate room instead of the shed, and I do respect my parents, and I also eat nutritious food during my period. So Namrata is 18 years old and working with us as a trainer on the project. And what she's saying at the end about respecting her parents and nutritious food is that for her parents and her mother-in-law and her family, it is a really big step to go from staying in the hut to into the house. And so this was kind of a compromise. So she understands that for her, the choice will be her own, but she does want to reach that mutual respect with her family for the time being. And then the second component of that is that generally during Chhaupadi, women and girls are not supposed to eat certain foods. So in the video, she mentioned not being able to have milk. There's a long list of other foods that are technically kind of off limits during Chhaupadi, as is going to like the church or the temple, depending on which religious belief people affiliate with. And then they're not supposed to cross rivers, and there's kind of a long list of things that you're not supposed to do. But her other emphasis was that eating nutritious food is really important when you're menstruating and when you're not menstruating. And so that was another compromise that she was able to reach. And so with that, kind of thinking back to the word cloud that was at the beginning of the presentation, the words that we're hearing often associated with menstruation are dirty and shame and uncomfortable. And this is a word cloud that our team put together on the words that we want to be associated with menstruation. So looking at things like dignity and strength and empowerment and esteem and opportunity. So this is really what we're working towards as a team. So our vision is that we live in a world where every woman and girl has ready access to hygiene solutions. That does not necessarily mean Days for Girls kits. There are plenty of women that prefer menstrual cups, for example, which we also have, but generally focus on the kit a little bit more just due to cultural acceptance and kind of the likelihood of using them. But we know that a lot of women and girls are not going to use the Days for Girls kit, and that's fine as long as they have ready access to something that they can use. And then our mission is to create a world with dignity, health, and opportunity for all through sustainable menstrual care solutions and health education. So we do a lot of programming related to economic empowerment and business training and different aspects of women's health, but at the core of our mission is really to shift the narrative surrounding menstruation. And so kind of the final thing that I'll leave you with before opening this up to questions is just that the main thing we do is focus on the Days for Girls kit and the health education, but the organization and the work that we're doing really is about a lot more than just passing out pads. It's about changing the narrative and making sure that there are local leaders and local women who can really lead this initiative in the countries that they live in. So thank you all so much for being here, and I will open it up to questions.
Time for some questions.
Yeah.
What are I've noticed the same issues in, like, I just moved here from Oakland, and the housing crisis is leaving a lot of people homeless, and one of the main things I got requests for when I asked people what they wanted was menstrual hygiene products, but then they were running into the disposal problem as well. So what are there Days for Girls groups in America too?
There are. Yeah, so we have, I don't know the exact number, but we have over 600 chapters and teams here within the US. And a lot of them are making and donating kits with the goal of them going internationally. But a lot of them are also doing local programming. So within the US, the main kind of demographics that we're working with are the homeless population. We also work with a lot of women in prison. And then the final component is in disaster relief settings. So whether that is in a hurricane setting or housing crisis, or just working with people that really need something kind of immediately, that is a big focus of our local chapters and teams. One challenge that the Days for Girls kit would have in especially for people living with homelessness is that you need access to somewhere to dry them. And so the washing part is actually pretty not easy, but doable if you can access water. The challenge is finding a place where you can dry them. And so that's one thing that we've had a little bit of conversations on in terms of how we can better mobilize kind of networks and people to create access to that. We do also have menstrual cups at Days for Girls, and a lot of the homeless populations that we work with opt for the menstrual cups because that's something that is a little bit more discreet and a lot easier to wash. You don't have to dry it because it's medical grade silicone, so it's fine for it to just be wet. So a lot of the groups that we work with that are focusing on that demographic will use the menstrual cup instead. But we do kind of a mixed approach with the populations here in the US.
You mentioned that sometimes this topic gets lost within the broader, women's health and women empowerment topic. But have you partnered, or what would be the difficulties associated with doing so with, for example, family planning organizations that try to get that message out there?
Yeah, so we partner with a lot of different organizations. So we have partnerships with like Rotary clubs that are doing kind of WASH programs, so water and sanitation programs. We partner with a lot of schools. Some of the organizations we partner with do have a family planning approach. One of the things at Days for Girls is that we are kind of explicitly and clearly non-political. And part of that is because regardless of what religion or political spectrum you're on, if you're a woman or a girl, most likely you're going to menstruate. And so we want to make sure that the programming that we have is really available to people everywhere. And in a lot of locations and contexts, there are just certain issues that would make it so we couldn't work there. So we don't expressly really deal with the issue of family planning, but a lot of the partners that implement Days for Girls kits and use them in their programs do. The main partners that we work with are generally local NGOs. So throughout Nepal, Guatemala, Uganda, each of those offices kind of sources their own partnerships, and that's generally a network of local NGOs and then individual groups of people that are working on this issue. We do have a couple conversations going on with larger groups like UNICEF or some of the UN-funded organizations that work globally. But yeah, it's kind of a variety of partners. Yeah, thank you.
Who are in your educational programs? Who are the instructors? Who are the teachers? Are they staff from here? Are they local? Or how are they trained and prepared?
Yeah, so it's kind of a mix of both. We have, everywhere we have an office or an enterprise, the staff and the people working at those groups have local trainers. So to become a local trainer at our Nepal office and our Uganda office, for example, each person would go through a 2-day training of trainers session where we go through the health curriculum kind of as a whole and then work through individual sections and observe them teaching it and provide feedback. When possible, if there's like a local clinic nearby, a lot of times we'll ask someone from the clinic to also be present so that they can address some of the more medical questions that come up. And then for areas where we don't have an office or an enterprise, we try to work with a local partner as much as possible, so we're always trying to mobilize local leadership. If that's not possible, it often is a staff member here from the US, and we've also gone through the same kind of training of trainers process where we do like going through the curriculum and then practice teaching it, and the team gives feedback on that.
One last question, go ahead.
So I was curious if you've seen a difference in the different age groups, how whether or not like they're receiving your message, and if there's less likelihood to accept the message, and if you're changing your approach to how you speak to, let's say, older women versus younger women.
Yeah, definitely. So for younger girls, I would say there's a lot more giggling. Like they just laugh a little bit more when we talk about this. So we do try to be a little bit more sensitive on jumping right in. Like we would never start just like with the anatomy slides up on the board. So we would like slowly kind of ease into that conversation. That said, they're really open to it, and they feel awkward and shy, but by the end, most people are generally asking questions. For older groups, we try to start with questions first, so honoring the fact that most people in the room probably do know information related to menstruation, whether they learned it in a formal setting or just through personal experience. So we will open with kind of questions and what have their observations been, what are challenges that they've identified that their community faces. We have a lot of hands-on activities like the sewing training where the girls get to make their own kits. We have kind of learned that for significantly older demographics that doesn't always work well just due to concerns with like vision or not being able to like sit for more extended amounts of time. But for the most part, I'd say we have a pretty consistent acceptance of the curriculum that we're teaching. It generally starts with some giggling and sort of awkwardness at the beginning and then kind of transitions through to people being really happy that there is a space to talk about it and being pretty open to talking about it. Yeah, thank you.
So, I wanted to make a couple of comments here. I'm really impressed with how you've been able to learn so many of the right approaches to conducting these kinds of projects overseas. I'm not sure that was from the University of Puget Sound or where that came from, but it's wonderful to see that you've implemented so many of the kinds of things that I try to teach about in my course in development administration, for example. And the other thing that really struck me in your presentation, Sarah, was you've got, there's this argument about whether or not you go into work as an NGO and you focus on one particular health issue and ignore all the other kinds of things that are going on. And what you've done with Days for Girls is very interesting because you have a focus, you have a particular interest that you're really concerned with, but you've been able to link that with so many other things. You've linked it with education, you've linked it with enterprise development, you've linked it with sustainability, you've got an evaluation component. So I think that's really quite profound in terms of what your organization has been able to do, and I think that that's a strong indication that you're going to be very successful in the long run. So before I say anything about next week's lecture, let's give Sarah one more round of applause. And individually as well. So
Thank you.
Next week we're going to have a talk by Nancy Fitch. Nancy Fitch is one of the co-chairs of the External Advisory Committee for the Global Public Health Program. And she's been doing, since she retired as the director of the Curry Health Center here on campus, she's been working overseas, primarily in Africa, with health systems for the last 8 years now. And in fact, she's just back from Rwanda, where her most recent tour was. And she's going to talk about an update on the global AIDS epidemic. So I encourage you to come next week and bring your friends, and also if you haven't yet signed up for the class but you'd like to, that's a wonderful idea. So I'll see you next week.